Imagine losing everything you hold dear in a matter of days, your wealth, your family, your health. What would you do if your faith was the only thing left? Would you cling to it, or would you curse the very God who allowed it all to be taken away? The story of Job is one of the most perplexing and challenging accounts in the Bible. It forces readers to wrestle with one of humanity's oldest questions: why do bad things happen to good people? Specifically, why would a loving and omnipotent God allow Satan, the embodiment of evil, to test the faith of one of his most faithful followers? In this video, we will dive deep into the story of Job, examine the theological and moral questions it raises, and explore how the lessons from this ancient text are still relevant to us today. Along the way, we will draw on biblical references, unravel the roles played by God and Satan, and try to understand the greater purpose behind Job's suffering. The story of Job is introduced in the first chapter of the book of Job, one of the oldest and most enigmatic books in the Bible. Job is described as blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil. Job 1:1. He's also prosperous, with large herds of livestock, a great number of servants, and a happy family with 7 sons and 3 daughters. In short, Job is living the perfect life, a life many would associate with God's favor and blessings. But then the narrative takes a sudden turn. A dramatic scene unfolds in the heavenly courts, where the sons of God, likely referring to angelic beings, come to present themselves before the Lord. Among them is Satan, whose name means the accuser or adversary. God, knowing full well the nature of Satan, asks him, "From where do you come?" Job 1:7. Satan responds, "From going to and fro on the earth, and from walking back and forth on it." It is at this point that God brings Job into the conversation, saying, "Have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, one who fears God and shuns evil?" Job 1:8. Satan, the ever-skeptical adversary, challenges Job's faithfulness, insinuating that Job's piety is purely self-serving. "Does Job fear God for nothing?" Satan asks. He argues that Job's loyalty is only due to the blessings and protection God has provided. "But now stretch out your hand and touch all that he has, and he will surely curse you to your face." Job 1:9-11. In one of the most unsettling moments in Scripture, God gives Satan permission to test Job, saying, "Behold, all that he has is in your power, only do not lay a hand on his person." Job 1:12. This raises an immediate question. Why would God allow this? Why would a loving, all-powerful deity let Satan wreak havoc on the life of a righteous man? Some readers find this scenario deeply unsettling, but it's crucial to understand that this story offers a unique insight into the dynamics of free will, faith, and the cosmic struggle between good and evil. What happens next is a cascade of tragedies. In a single day, Job's wealth is obliterated. His livestock are stolen or destroyed, his servants are slaughtered, and, worst of all, his children are killed when a great wind collapses the house where they are feasting. Job 1:13-19. Job's response is profound. Instead of cursing God, he mourns deeply but remains faithful. Tearing his robe and shaving his head in grief, Job falls to the ground in worship, saying, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." Job 1:21. Satan, however, is not satisfied. He goes back to the heavenly court and argues that Job's loyalty persists only because his personal health has been spared. Satan then asks for permission to afflict Job's body, and God once again allows Satan to do so, saying, "Behold, he is in your hand, but spare his life." Job 2:6. What follows is even more tormenting. Job is struck with painful sores from head to toe. Job 2:7. And his suffering is so extreme that his own wife urges him to curse God and die. Job 2:9. Yet, even in this moment of unimaginable pain, Job refuses to sin with his lips. Instead, he responds, "Shall we indeed accept good from God, and shall we not accept adversity?" Job 2:10. As Job sits in agony, 3 of his friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, come to visit him. Initially, they offer him silent companionship, sitting with him in the dust for 7 days and nights without speaking a word, for they saw that his suffering was very great. Job 2:13. When they finally begin to speak, however, their words offer little comfort. Instead of offering encouragement or sympathy, they accuse Job of being at fault for his suffering. According to their logic, Job must have sinned against God, because in their understanding, suffering is always the result of personal wrongdoing. This line of reasoning reflects a common belief in the ancient world, and still today, that good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people, a concept sometimes referred to as retributive justice. If Job is suffering so intensely, they reason, it must be because he has sinned and is being punished by God. However, Job insists on his innocence. He laments his suffering and questions why he, a righteous man, is enduring such unimaginable pain. Yet, even in his confusion and despair, Job never curses God, though he does come close to accusing God of being unjust. Job 19:6-7. After long speeches from Job and his friends, another figure, Elihu, speaks, providing a different perspective. But it is not until God himself speaks that the true climax of the story occurs. In chapters 38-41, God responds to Job, not by directly explaining the reason for Job's suffering, but by pointing to his own sovereignty and wisdom. From the midst of a whirlwind, God asks Job a series of rhetorical questions, reminding him of the vastness of creation and the limitations of human understanding. "Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me, if you have understanding." Job 38:4. Through these questions, God highlights the incomprehensible complexity of the universe and the limitations of human beings to fully grasp his ways. God's response is not an explanation of why Job suffered. Rather, it is a reminder that God's wisdom and purpose are far beyond human understanding. The message seems to be that Job, and by extension all of humanity, cannot fully comprehend the divine plan, but that does not mean God is unjust or uncaring. Instead, Job is called to trust in God's wisdom, even when it is beyond his ability to understand. After God's speech, Job responds with humility and repentance. He acknowledges his limited understanding and submits to God's greater wisdom, saying, "I know that you can do everything, and that no purpose of yours can be withheld from you. Therefore, I have uttered what I did not understand, things too wonderful for me, which I did not know." Job 42:2-3. In the end, God restores Job's fortunes, giving him twice as much as he had before. Job's wealth is restored, he has more children, and he lives a long and prosperous life. Job 42:10-17. However, the most important outcome of the story is not the material restoration, but Job's deepened understanding of God's nature and his unwavering faith, even in the midst of profound suffering. So, why did God allow Satan to test Job? While the book of Job does not provide a simple, clear-cut answer, several key themes emerge. The testing of faith. One reason for Job's suffering is to demonstrate the authenticity of his faith. Satan challenged Job's motives, suggesting that his loyalty to God was contingent on his blessings. By allowing the test, God proves that Job's faith is genuine, rooted in trust in God's character, not in material prosperity. The nature of suffering. Job's story reveals that suffering is not always a result of personal sin. Sometimes righteous people suffer for reasons beyond human comprehension. This counters the simplistic view of retributive justice, showing that life is more complex than a system of rewards and punishments. God's sovereignty and wisdom. The story emphasizes that God's ways are higher than human understanding. We may not always understand why we suffer, but we are called to trust in God's greater wisdom and purpose. The reality of spiritual warfare. Job's story gives us a glimpse into the cosmic struggle between good and evil. Satan is real, and he seeks to undermine human faith. However, God remains in control, and even when Satan is allowed to test us, it is always within the boundaries set by God. Faith through adversity. Job's story teaches that true faith is not dependent on life circumstances. Job's faith endures even when he loses everything. This is a powerful lesson for believers today, reminding us that our relationship with God should not be based on material blessings, but on trust in his character and his eternal plan. One of the most intriguing aspects of the book of Job is the role Satan plays in Job's suffering. We tend to think of Satan as the great adversary, always seeking to oppose God's work and cause destruction. In Job's story, however, Satan is seen not as a rogue force acting independently, but as a being operating within the bounds of God's permission. This raises several key theological questions. Why would God allow Satan to test Job in the first place? What does this say about the nature of Satan's role in the world? And what does it reveal about the character of God? To answer these questions, we must first consider the larger biblical context of Satan's role. In the Bible, Satan is often portrayed as the accuser, one who delights in pointing out the failings and weaknesses of humanity. His name in Hebrew, Ha-Satan, literally means the adversary or the accuser. This role is clearly seen in the book of Job, where Satan challenges the sincerity of Job's faith, insinuating that Job's loyalty is only surface deep, based on the material blessings he enjoys. In fact, the interaction between God and Satan in the opening chapters of Job mirrors a legal scene in which Satan acts as a prosecutor, accusing Job of having ulterior motives for his righteousness. Satan asserts that Job is faithful only because his life is easy, blessed with prosperity, good health and family. Satan's underlying claim is that no human can be truly loyal to God unless they are bribed with blessings. This is a direct challenge to the integrity of human faith and the goodness of God. The fact that God allows Satan to test Job may seem troubling at first glance, but it's important to recognize that this permission is not given lightly. Satan is not granted unlimited power. God sets strict limits on what Satan can and cannot do. First, Satan is forbidden from laying a hand on Job's person, Job 1:12. And then, even when Satan is allowed to afflict Job's health, he is still not allowed to take Job's life, Job 2:6. These limitations show that, while Satan has a certain degree of influence, God is always ultimately in control. Satan cannot act without God's explicit permission. This brings us to the heart of the matter. God allows the test to unfold, not because he delights in suffering or because he is indifferent to Job's plight, but because the test has a greater purpose. It serves to demonstrate the authenticity of Job's faith and, by extension, the power of true, selfless loyalty to God. Through this test, Job's faith is shown to be genuine, not based on what he can gain from God, but on a deep, unwavering trust in God's character, even in the face of unimaginable loss. Another key element of the Job narrative is the role of free will in the cosmic drama between good and evil. Job's test is not just about his individual suffering. It's part of a larger story about the freedom humans have to choose whether or not to remain faithful to God in the midst of adversity. Job, like all human beings, is endowed with free will, the ability to make choices. This freedom is a central theme throughout the Bible, from the Garden of Eden to the choices faced by the apostles in the New Testament. Free will allows for genuine relationships between God and His creation, but it also opens the door for suffering and evil, because human beings and spiritual beings like Satan can choose to rebel against God's plan. In the book of Job, we see this tension between free will and divine sovereignty play out in dramatic fashion. Satan is given permission to test Job, but Job has the freedom to respond as he chooses. Will he curse God, as Satan predicts, or will he remain faithful even in the face of overwhelming hardship? What makes Job's story so powerful is that he chooses to remain faithful despite the circumstances. Job's response to suffering is an act of profound free will. He chooses to trust God, even when every outward sign suggests that God has abandoned him. This choice underscores one of the Bible's most profound truths. True faith is not about what we can gain from God. It's about trusting in God's goodness, even when we cannot understand His ways. One of the most striking aspects of the book of Job is God's initial silence in the face of Job's suffering. For much of the book, God does not intervene or offer any explanation for Job's torment. This silence can be deeply unsettling, especially for readers who expect an immediate resolution to the problem of suffering. In many ways, God's silence in the book of Job mirrors the experience of many people who suffer today. When we face tragedy or hardship, we often cry out to God for answers, but those answers do not always come in the form we expect. Like Job, we may feel abandoned or forgotten by God during our darkest moments. Yet, Job's story teaches us that God's silence does not mean He is absent or indifferent. In fact, God's ultimate response to Job, when it finally comes, demonstrates His deep care for Job, even though He never directly explains the reason for the suffering. Instead, God speaks out of the whirlwind, reminding Job of His majesty, wisdom, and the complexity of creation. Job 38-41. Through these words, God reveals that human beings, limited by their finite understanding, cannot fully grasp the divine purposes behind suffering. This divine silence and later revelation point to a profound mystery. While we may not always understand why we suffer, we are invited to trust in God's ultimate wisdom and goodness. Job never receives a direct answer to the question of why he suffered, but he comes to understand that God's ways are higher than human comprehension. This realization brings Job to a place of humility and submission, acknowledging that God's purposes are beyond his ability to grasp. Throughout the Bible, suffering is often portrayed as a refining process, a way in which faith is tested, purified, and strengthened. This is certainly true in the case of Job. Before his suffering, Job is described as a righteous man, blameless and upright. Job 1:1. But by the end of his ordeal, Job's faith has been deepened in a way that could only have been achieved through his experience of loss and hardship. This theme of suffering as a means of spiritual growth is echoed throughout Scripture. In the New Testament, for example, the Apostle Peter writes, "In this you greatly rejoice, though now for a little while you may have had to suffer grief in all kinds of trials. These have come so that the proven genuineness of your faith, of greater worth than gold, which perishes even though refined by fire, may result in praise, glory, and honor when Jesus Christ is revealed." 1 Peter 1:6-7. Similarly, the Apostle Paul speaks of suffering as a means of producing perseverance, character, and hope. Romans 5:3-5. While suffering is never something we seek out or desire, it can serve a higher purpose in our spiritual development, shaping us into the people God intends us to be. For Job, the experience of suffering ultimately leads him to a deeper understanding of God's nature and his own place in the universe. At the beginning of the story, Job's faith is strong, but perhaps it is somewhat simplistic, based on a transactional view of God's blessings and rewards. By the end of the story, Job's faith has been refined and deepened. He no longer views God through the lens of reward and punishment. Instead, he has come to trust in God's wisdom, even when he cannot fully understand it. In Job's final words to God, we see the culmination of this growth. "I know that you can do all things. No purpose of yours can be thwarted. My ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you." Job 42:2-5. Job has moved from knowing about God to truly encountering him, and it is this deeper relationship with God that is the ultimate reward for his faithfulness. Another crucial element of Job's story is the role of his friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. Initially, these friends come to offer comfort to Job in his time of need. For 7 days, they sit with him in silence, mourning alongside him. Job 2:13. This act of silent companionship is a powerful example of empathy and solidarity in the face of suffering. However, once they begin to speak, Job's friends shift from comforting companions to harsh critics. Their speeches are filled with accusations, suggesting that Job must have sinned in some way to deserve such intense suffering. According to their worldview, which reflects a common belief at the time, suffering is always a consequence of sin, and prosperity is a sign of righteousness. This belief is known as retributive justice, the idea that God rewards the righteous and punishes the wicked in direct proportion to their actions. While this concept is present in parts of the Bible, the book of Job challenges this simplistic view of suffering. Job's friends are wrong in their assumptions. They fail to see that Job's suffering is not a result of personal sin, but part of a larger divine plan that transcends human understanding. Job's friends, in their attempts to explain his suffering, become a cautionary example of how not to respond to someone in pain. Instead of offering empathy, they offer judgment. Instead of listening, they assume they know the cause of Job's suffering. Their error serves as a reminder that when we encounter others in distress, our first response should be one of compassion, not condemnation. In the end, God rebukes Job's friends for their harshness and lack of understanding. He tells Eliphaz, "I am angry with you and your 2 friends because you have not spoken the truth about me as my servant Job has." Job 42:7. This rebuke underscores the importance of humility in the face of suffering, both our own and that of others. The story of Job continues to resonate with people because it addresses timeless questions about suffering, faith, and the nature of God. While we may never fully understand why God allows certain trials in our lives, Job's story teaches us that suffering can serve a greater purpose, refining our faith and deepening our trust in God. Ultimately, Job's unwavering loyalty to God, despite unimaginable suffering, serves as a powerful example of faith. His story reminds us that, even when we cannot see the full picture, we are called to trust in God's wisdom and goodness, knowing that He is always in control. Like Job, we may face times of intense trial, and we may even wrestle with doubts and questions. But the story of Job encourages us to hold fast to our faith, trusting that God has a greater purpose, even in our darkest moments.